Welcome to the Kissing Spine podcast. How nice of you to join. In this podcast, I discuss several topics around kissing spine, like what kissing spine is, the different medical treatments, the function of different body parts, functional and dysfunctional training techniques, saddle fit, and a whole lot more. All put together to help you support your horse with the kissing spine. I wish you a lot of fun listening, and if you like this podcast, make sure to become a subscriber so you won't miss any of my episodes. Hi everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of the Kissing Spine podcast. In this episode, I want to explain more about rehabilitation training. As we all know, there are multiple ways to roam, and I want to prevent down talking or bashing other people's work. I see no point in this. So in this podcast, I mainly want to share how I look at rehab training, what to take into account, what you are looking for, and why. As explained in previous podcasts, there are several things that can cause a kissing spine. A horse that has one out of how he's being bred is a different or has a different state of mind and habit of movement than a horse that's been trained into a kissing spine. This is something I want to leave for a later podcast. Right now, I mainly want to talk about what transition needs to be made inside of the body regardless of how the horse got the kissing spine. I want to keep things as simple and visual, so I'm not going to bother you with all terms of bones and muscles. I just want you to get a basic understanding of how the body and the body's movement functions. Because once you get that, it's so much easier to train your horse and to understand what you're looking for in the training. So basically, if you cut it all down to what it is you want, it's fairly simple. You want more space between the vertebrae. It's not very complicated. So what needs to happen for this is that the horse is going to move the body in such a way that the spine is brought up instead of going down. Because the more, let's say the gravity is doing its job. If you're going to sit on top of the horse, the spine automatically, because of gravity, is going to go down. So if the horse has a way of moving where it's not going to bring its spine up, while your weight is pushing down the spine, the vertebrae are getting more crushed instead of being opened up. So what you want is for the horse to learn to move the body in such a way that the spine is being pushed up in the motion instead of being pushed down by gravity. In order for this to happen, you need the body mechanics. So there's two parts that I want to discuss today. One is the skeletal mechanics, and then I want to discuss a little bit more about muscles. But let's do the skeletal first, because the skeleton is the basic building blocks of the body of the horse when it comes to its structure. So the full basics is the skeleton. So when you're looking at the hind end of the horse, the hind leg is hanging in the pelvis, swinging forward. So the hind leg swings forward, the horse steps down, puts weight on it, and then actually the other hind leg is being swung forward. So the hind legs are constantly making a swinging motion forward. So let's start by creating a picture in your head. Close your eyes and see the body of your horse moving, where the hind leg is being swung forward, it's being stepped down, it's putting weight on that leg, and then it's going to move backwards, and then it's being pulled up, and then it's being swung forward again. It's going to be put down. Actually, the other hind leg is being swung forward, and that's the motion of the hind leg. So every time the horse is swinging a hind leg forward, the downside of the pelvis gets a little tucked down and forward. And actually, that part you can feel relatively easy. If you look at the tail of your horse, on both sides of the tail, there's a little bump. With some horses, this is a little bit more visual than the other. But you can feel a little bit of a hard bump. And this is the seat bones of your horse. And in front of that's where the hind leg of the horse is connected to the pelvis. So when that hind leg is swinging forward, the downside of that pelvis, so a little bit in front of that bump, is being pulled down and forward. So that pelvis is getting a little tucked down and forward on the downside. So see if you can picture that hind leg swinging again. So it's swinging forward, and when it's swinging forward, that pelvis is getting a little bit tucked down and forward. And when that pelvis is getting a tuck down and forward, the upside of that pelvis, which is around the SI joint, is getting a tuck up and a little bit backwards. So that pelvis is a little bit tilting, shifting. It's changing its angle, so to say. So when we're talking about a tucked in pelvis, you can see if you can even practice that with your own body. You feel that your pelvis is mobilized, and you can feel that that tuck moving forward. Well, that's the movement that the pelvis is made when the hind leg is swinging really forward. So pretty much the forces of the hind leg's motion are brought into the spine by the SI joint, because the SI joint connects the pelvis to the spine. And that movement of that hind leg, the pelvis is being tucked down and forward, the upside is being tucked or moved upward and backwards, and then the connected vertebrae to that SI joint is influenced with that motion as well. So you can imagine that the bigger the swing of that hind leg is, the more that force of that swing is being transmitted by the SI joint to the other connected vertebrae. The bigger the movement, the more vertebrae are being affected. And those vertebrae are working like shackles. They're connected to each other. So if one moves, the rest will follow for a certain amount. It will lose a little bit of the force every next vertebrae, but you want to achieve as much as possible. So once you understand this, you can imagine that the more the hind leg can swing underneath and forward, the more vertebrae will be influenced with this movement. When this is enough, the connected neck vertebrae, which are connected to the spinal vertebrae, are being influenced as well. So when the spine goes up, the neck will drop. And at that point, the spine is at its longest as it can get, and more space is being created between the vertebrae. So one of the biggest myths is that rehabilitation training of the kissing spine starts with the head of the horse going down. If you approach rehabilitation training from that angle, it would mean that only the head going down would help the back of your horse. But if you do it that way, you completely neglect the influence of the hind leg. So if you're only focusing of the head going down, the hind end is going to follow, but the horse will completely collapse on its forehand, and that's not what you want. You want that hind leg activated and being brought forward, swung forward, so that pelvis gets that tuck. The SI joint transmits the force of that hind leg swing into the vertebrae, and because the spine is going up by the movement, the head is going to go down. That would be the most sustainable way to help your horse rehabilitate from a kissing spine. That's the full motion, the full movement that you need to do this. If you want this more visualized, if you want to have more picture with this, I have a free course called The Mechanics of the Hind Leg. If you're interested in this, you can check out my Facebook group, Kissing Spine Rehabilitation Training with SDJ Horse Training. Or you can send me a Facebook message or an email, and I will get you the link. It's for free, so you can just sign up and watch that video as well. I explain more about this with more visuals. If a horse has been compensating its movement for a long time, it's possible that the hind leg is a little bit rusty. The joints can get a little bit stuck. Therefore, it's vital that the hind leg and the SI joint get mobilized. And therefore, it can take some time before you get a nice, active, flowy stretch or walk out of your horse in the beginning. It's not because your horse doesn't want to or will never be able to do it. It's just because your horse needs time and practice to mobilize. And actually, the importance of this I learned when I broke my elbow 2 years ago after falling off my bike. I had a race bike. I thought it was a good idea. Oh gosh, how I got back from that idea. So I fell off my bike. I didn't even go fast, but I just felt very unlucky. And I broke off the tip of my elbow. And that's exactly the point where the triceps that make it possible for me to stretch my elbow completely was disconnected from my lower arm. So I could bend my elbow. I just couldn't stretch it anymore. So I went to the hospital, obviously, because I noticed right away that something was seriously wrong with my arm. I was put into a casket and I had to wait 2 weeks before they had time to perform surgery on my arm due to COVID. I was busy in the hospital. Everything was delayed. So unlucky me, but I already heard that I needed to have surgery within 2 weeks because else I could lose permanent movement and mobilization in my arm. So in 2 weeks, being in the casket, obviously, I couldn't move my elbow. Then I had the surgery. And after surgery, I had to wait for another 2 weeks before the stitches could be taken out. And no one told me that in the meantime, after the surgery, I already had to start moving my arm. And I was in a lot of pain. So, I just kept my arm in a matella and didn't do anything. Then after those 2 weeks, I went back to the hospital because the stitches needed to be taken out, and I'm not even going to tire you with all the medical mistakes that were made. But I got there, they took out the stitches, and then they told me, okay, you're ready to go to physical therapy. No one still told me that I had to start moving my arm. They told me to go to physical therapy. So I called the physical therapist. I called multiple actually, and no one had time within the first 2 weeks. So by the time I had my first appointment with my physical therapist, I didn't move my arm for 6 weeks. And when I got there, she was a very nice lady, but she checked out my arm. She said, "You didn't move your arm for 6 weeks? I hope that we can get your mobility back." So we calculated I had lost 95% of my mobility in my elbow, and not because of the lack of strength in my arm, but due to the fact that because of the lack of movement in the elbow got stuck. The joint just got stuck. So in 6 weeks time of not moving my elbow, I lost 95% of mobility. And it took me over 4 months of physical therapy 3 times a week, which I can assure you it wasn't comfortable, to gain back 90% of that. It took me 4 months to get back mobility I had lost over 6 weeks. So when this happened, I obviously had a lot of time to think because I couldn't do anything. So it made me wonder if this is what is happening in my body in such a short amount of time. What would happen inside the body of a horse that's been compensating and limited in the motion of the joints of the hind legs and the SI joint, which are so important in the rehab process, for a longer time? So I started calling and emailing a couple of vets, and I discussed this with them. Like, I noticed that this is happening with my body, but then you have the joints inside the body of the horse. So what's going on with these joints when they're limited in motion for a longer period of time? And they all came back with the same conclusion, or the same statement, that this is exactly what's happening inside the body of the horse as well. And then especially the stifles are the joints that are most affected by limited motion. So, well, this was 6 weeks and no movement at all. Obviously, horses move more than nothing. Even if they're locked up in a stall, they walk around, so the joints move a little bit. But imagine a horse that's been compensating and has been limited in movements for over a year. How much mobility he might have lost in the hind legs and SI joint, and how this affects the body's recovery. The longer the horse has been compensating, The longer the horse is not being fully mobile in its joints, the longer it will take to regain back this mobility. And you can imagine that it's absolutely vital that the horse is going to start being mobilized through the hind leg and the SI joint as a part of the rehab process. If you're not taking this along, you're losing a very big component that influences the spine. And this is also why unbalanced feet can cause so many issues in the back. If a foot is unbalanced and the horse cannot properly use his feet, all this is translated in its movement that goes through the joints and then back to the spine. So kissing spine can come from multiple things, as I've explained before, but also kissing spine is often combined with more issues. This is also why tendon issues can cause so many problems, because if a horse is on stall rest and has limited motion due to tendon issues, this affects joints. So taking this view or taking this perception of rehab training, you can actually apply it to multiple things, not just kissing spine. Everything is connected in the body. It's one whole. So everything works back and forth. So let's go back to the skeletal mechanics a little bit more. The more the joints are being mobilized, the more force from the hind leg swing can be brought into the spine, which in the end will create the space that we are looking for. So that's the mechanics of the skeleton that you need. So now let's take a look at the muscles and tendons, because for the bones to be able to move, we need the muscles and tendons. Those bones are not going to move by itself. I am not going to bother you with the function of each muscle, but you can imagine that a horse that's not used to use the body in this way doesn't have the right muscle strength to support it all from the beginning. You cannot expect an amazing result out of nowhere. Like if you have a big fat belly and you go to the gym for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you don't have a six pack. So the body needs a process of, getting muscle buildup. And the older the horse, the harder it's going to be to build up muscle. It's not impossible, it's just going to be harder. So that's why you don't just want to take your time to mobilize the joints. You also want to give your horse time to develop muscles that he needs to support the right movement. And in this principle, this is where the baseline comes into play. The baseline is the level of training the horse can handle without losing the right movement of the body. You want to be able to step by step tell when your horse can still handle the work and when it's becoming too much. This is why I always start the mobilization and creating the first line of muscle strength in hand. This is where I can be close to the horse and support the horse where needed. I can explain how to use the body and I can help him mobilize. And I can do this for as long as the horse needs. In the beginning, I keep the sessions very short because, there's a whole psychological thing about this as well that I will say for another podcast. But you don't want to stress the body. You want to keep the work fun. And you don't want to stress the body. So if you just purely keep looking at the body itself, you don't want muscles to become sore. You don't want to be, because it's mobilizing is not a comfortable thing, So if the horse is really stiff, you really need to give your horse some time. It's better to do 3 short sessions of 5 or 10 minutes a day than doing a full session of half an hour and ask the complete max out of it, because your horse will lose the fun of it, because it's really uncomfortable getting a joint to be mobilized again. It's not easy. So the more stiff and the more stuck your horse is, the shorter you need to keep the beginning. And that means that the beginning is going to be hard, but as soon as the mobilization is there, muscles are going to develop and it's going to get a whole lot faster. The beginning is the toughest part. Do you have a young horse with very mild kissing spine? Obviously, this process is going to be a whole lot easier. But the older the horse and the worse the kissing spine and the more stiff he is in the body, the harder this process is going to be. It's not impossible. It's just going to be hard. It's going to require a lot of patience from your side. But working in hand is going to be the way to help your horse push the spine up without the weight of the rider on top of it, because obviously you can imagine that if the horse is not mobilized and cannot really bring the spine up just yet, and you're going to be on top of it, you're going to make the life of your horse significantly amount harder. You don't want to do that. You want to do it in hand. You want to help your horse understand how to use the body. You want to help your horse mobilize. There are multiple exercises for this. A semi-turn on the forehand. You want to keep that front legs moving, but you really want to start with asking the horse to step under with the hind legs. I'm also going to explain more about this in a different podcast, and you can find videos on this in my Facebook group. But this is why the work in hand is so important. This is the function, explaining the horse how to move and giving him time to mobilize and get stronger. But if the horse can do a flowy, soft, active, stretchy walk, I can start introducing lunging. Because there I can start really close to the horse, and then I can add a little bit more distance first. So the horse is going to move a little bit more independently. He will have less support from me as to do more by itself. So this is a phase of training you need to go through. And from there on, if that goes well, I can slowly start to add some trot work. And actually, I can also do some walk-trot transitions to help the body activate. More about this in another episode, but just to give you a general idea, if the horse can keep a little bit of distance, you can start with some walk-trot transitions, and from there you can add more and more trot work. Very important in this, if the body loses softness and loses its right movement, it's too much for the horse and I need to take a step back, because continuing in a movement that's not mobilized and it's not requiring the right muscles to work, it's not giving me anything but putting me back into the training. So then, having patience and giving the horse more time is a lot more sustainable than pushing through while the horse cannot handle it. But the more time you give the horse in this, and the stronger the horse becomes, eventually he will be able to do a fair bit of walk and trot on the line. And if that goes well, I can start adding a saddle to the process. See if the saddle is still fitting. If the quality of the work is being lost when I add the saddle, I know the saddle is not fitting. Maybe I need to deal with some psychological issues, because ridden horses with a kissing spine can have a really bad feeling about the saddle. So you need to make sure the saddle is fitting, which you can check, but you can also check his emotional state with the saddle. So if the horse is getting really tense and you know 100% sure that the saddle is fitting, you need to help him through that process first before you're going to get on, to keep things sustainable. But if that all goes well, you can get on for a couple of rounds, like max 5 minutes. I will keep absolutely that at the max, but see if you can get him to that same flowy, relaxed, soft walk. If that goes well, you can start building up the walk. If that's not possible and the horse's back is being lost in the process, the horse is not strong enough, you can take a step back, do another week or 2 weeks of the work that you're doing, expand a little bit on that. And if that goes well, you can try to get on it for another 5 minutes. And from there, you're going to play and systematically bring your horse back into the ridden work. This is rehab training. It's not a one-size-fits all. It's the basics. How does the body have to move? How does your horse do that sustainably? Because in the end, a horse is not made to be ridden. We want to do it, but if you want to do it, we have to train the horse to move its body in such a way that it's healthy for the horse to be ridden. So this is what rehabilitation training looks like. In the next episode, I'm more going to talk about medical treatments, because as I explained before, doing the rehab training, especially the mobilization of joints, can be a very uncomfortable process for the horse, and there are ways to medically support your horse through this process. Not every horse needs it. Absolutely not every horse needs it, but if you notice that your horse could use it, it's really important to understand what medical treatment does what. That I'm going to explain in another episode. Do you want to know more now? Do you want to have more visuals with what I'm talking about? I have how to create a rehab plan for sale at $37. It's 2.5 hours of footage in which I take you through how to assess the specific case of your horse. What are the important things to look at? I am discussing more about rehabilitation training. I am explaining more visually about medical treatments. I'm explaining more about the baseline and how to use it. And of course, I added some exercises that you can start doing to help your horse mobilize and get stronger. If you're interested in this, you can send me an email. You can check out the website www.stjhorsetraining.nl. You can also go to my Facebook group, Kissing Spine Rehabilitation Training with STJ Horse Training. Thank you so much for listening, and hopefully you're there for the next episode. I would like to thank you again for listening to this podcast. If you think that this podcast is interesting to someone else, please share it on social media so others can find it too. This way, we can create more awareness about what the options are with a kissing spine horse. I would like to thank you again for listening to this podcast. If you think that this podcast is interesting to someone else, please share it on social media so others can find it too. This way, we can create more awareness about what the options are with a kissing spine horse.